Jad, thank you so much again for taking the time on this. I know that you're usually busy and on the field, which is obviously mandatory when it comes to your job. I want to know if you would like to take us through or evaluate in a nutshell how much is the children affected in Lebanon due to what happened lately with the blast in Beirut. Add to this, obviously, the COVID-19 that we've been dealing with for almost a year now.
Okay, hi. Thanks for having me. So in terms of the blast itself, the effects on the children were many, of course. As you know, from the blast, we had around 300,000 people who were displaced. And of course, that includes children. We estimate that around 100,000 children were displaced. So they were without a shelter. And so that, of course, is huge in itself. But of course, the displacement itself and the movement and getting out of their comfort zones was also quite traumatic. In addition, of course, to the trauma of the explosion, we did a number of interviews with children in the immediate aftermath of the blast. And different children were telling us about how they experienced, of course, this explosion and the trauma. They were telling us that they did not dare, for example, to go in the rooms they were in when the blast happened, or that they were missing their toys, or their friends, or their neighbors, or things like that. So that's in terms of the kind of immediate effects of the blast. But for children in general, and especially since November of 2019, you mentioned Corona, but also the situation as a whole, the political instability, which not all children can relate to, but the economics and all of that. Children have seen their parents struggle increasingly in terms of the economy. And that, of course, has also had direct repercussions on them. If you talk about schooling, for example, between the political instability, the coronavirus, and the uncertainty now, in the last year, the scholastic year of 2019-2020, children attended school for 3 to 4 months out of the whole year. So, of course, there are gaps that accumulate. Again, they're not socializing with their friends at school and all of that. Even now, there's uncertainty about which approach the authorities are ultimately going to adopt. They're talking about a blended approach. So blended approach means that there's at least some element of remote learning. Remote learning, we know from interviews we've also conducted, in some ways it's difficult depending on the age of the children. Of course, it's more or less difficult, but for young children, it's quite difficult. It's not the same. In some cases, parents have had to bring in private tutors to support children, so that's an additional cost at a time of economic crisis. Tablets also, for example, are costly. The internet infrastructure in Lebanon is far from great, to say the least. So of course, there are challenges related to that. And then moving forward, again, the uncertainty for the parents and the children is not easy to deal with. And then, of course, one last thing, the poverty itself. You know, with the hyperinflation in Lebanon, with to some extent the shortage of goods, with the mass terminations, everything that I think is quite known now. Children, in some cases, have had to resort, children and their parents, to what we call negative coping mechanisms. What does that mean? It means, for example, they sometimes go to bed hungry, or they lower the calorie intake, or they lower the quality of food they're having. And then if you push it to the extreme in families that really are having a hard time economically, in some cases, they are choosing not to re-enroll their children in school. And that for us is a main risk, because then we're talking about, you know, lost generations, essentially.
Absolutely.
You know, school has become, unfortunately, to some extent, a luxury. And of course, there's the fact they wouldn't enroll in school, because school is becoming deprioritized by the children, by the parents. But also, in some cases, we're seeing, and we're going to continue to see, an increase in what we call child labor. So children who are engaged in work to support the family economically. And that is a problem on so many levels. Of course, the education is being lost, but also the children are working, which is not where their natural place is, far from it. And then you do have the extreme of the extreme, which is what we would call the worst forms of child labor, meaning children working in conditions that are very difficult. So, for example, working long hours in the fields, in agriculture, or working in, for example, mechanics, car mechanics shop, where they have access and are exposed to possibly dangerous tools.
Material that they're not supposed to be
dealing with. No, far. Far from it, yeah. And so it's the accumulation of all of these crises, you know, the blast, the COVID, and then of course the economic crisis that is making it very difficult for children, their families, and the communities they work in.
So the effect is not only financial, it's emotional as well. If we're going to talk about you as an association, do you offer this 360 approach where you are covering this child from all aspects and not only financially? Like as a team, what's your contribution exactly, and how does it work? Just in order for us to highlight for the people who are going to hopefully support us for this case, and for them to understand what are the different jobs that you guys offer under the Save the Children Association.
Yes, of course. You know, depending on the needs, of course, and on the assessments, we will intervene, you know, from this or that perspective. But generally, our programs will be integrated, meaning we will bring in different sectors and different types of activities. And I can give you a few examples of that. Because the problems that children face, children and their families, are generally multidimensional and multi-layered. It's not one issue, it's a number of issues. Let's talk about child labor, for example. To be able to get a child out of child labor, of course, there's the work we do under the child protection sector, and more specifically, the case management. Case management meaning the individual and customized and tailored support from a protection lens to the children and their families. So, of course, we would work with the child and with their family to explain to them the dangers, for example, of child labor. But that becomes empty talk if you don't provide the families with an alternative.
Of course,
and so what we would do is we would integrate what we would call the food security and livelihoods component, meaning to find a way through coaching and after discussions and consultation with the family to provide them with income generating activities.
Okay.
So we remove the child because we're able to convince the parents, for example, from the labor, but we provide the parents with alternatives economically. It could be in the form of basic assistance if they have no skills. So for example, a cash influx.
Yes.
Or it could be to help them with a longer term income generating activity. So for example, a support to their micro businesses if they have micro business or the willingness to get into that. They could be vocational training, they could be things like that. And after we've removed the child from labor, then the child has free time to go and be in his or her natural place. And that would be education, for example. And so we would enroll that child in our non-formal education programs, unless they can enroll into the formal education system, so the formal public schooling system, and then we would also support them there. So yes, generally it will be a number of different things.
So can you say that you accompany those children till the end? Like there's no timeline, you're basically making sure and ensuring they are in the right environment for their age group. It's not something that you do once and that's it. It's like a continuous, you're constantly in contact with them and you're ensuring that they are well covered.
No, of course. So I'm going to give you the nuanced answer. So of course, when we do, for example, case management services, of course, we accompany the child through a relatively prolonged period. Could be 6, could be 9, could be 12 months. It could be further if needed, but then we can talk a bit about the nature of our work. But definitely, it's not a one-off. We take them through a process for the psychosocial support. If they've had trauma, for example, as a result of the blast, of course, that needs to be a relatively prolonged and sustained process. So we take them through that entire process. If, again, someone is out of child labor and into school, then we follow up with them on a weekly basis with their families. We make sure it's going well, the integration is happening well, and things like that. For the, again, psychosocial projects, those are kind of prolonged projects. Now, the nature of humanitarian and developmental work and the nature of donors means that sometimes, there may be situations where you would want to follow a child for 2-3 years. That's not always possible, but as much as possible, of course, we try to make sure that they get the proper follow-up that they require.
Okay. And if you are today to send out a message in order to ask people to support this cause, obviously, how do you usually do it? I know we're going to talk a little bit about the collaboration and how it started with BVLGARI, that are known obviously for this kind of humanitarian work for so many years. And I really would want to know, how did it start for you guys to collaborate? Who contacted who? Where did it start exactly? And obviously end it with a message for all our viewers to explain to them what are usually the need and how frequent are those needs.
So let me start with the relationship with BVLGARI. The relationship with BVLGARI is more than 10 years old. And it's one that is, I would say, constructive, of course, one that is very useful, one that is based on mutual discussions. One of the things BVLGARI has always tried to do is try to address actual needs. And so we have discussions about what the actual needs are. And of course, our work on the field and our access to the field allows us to get a clear sense of what the needs are. BVLGARI is also always keen to support a kind of innovative program and technologies and the arts in their programming. And that is very much needed. We're always concerned as humanitarian NGOs not to be as up-to-date as we need to be and as innovative as we need to be. And so when we have partners like BVLGARI, it's very much helpful because they have the resources, they have the willingness, and so we're able to develop programs that are very impactful from that perspective. For the people in general, I mean, you know, I'm going to state the obvious, but there's no better investment than to invest in children. And then within that, of course, education. That is the one thing they can never, that no one can ever take away from children, and the one thing that, you know, once you have and once you're empowered with, that opens so many doors. And then, of course, you want them to have mental well-being and psychosocial well-being. You want them to be children that have empathy.
Obviously, in everyone's life, basically, that's the core of
course,
their future.
Of course, but for children who are exposed to some kind of trauma, and trauma can be immediate, like the blast, and can be again prolonged, like for example, long periods of poverty.
Yeah.
For a child, if this is not addressed relatively quickly, they easily, for example, lose their ability to empathize, or their ability to socialize, or to connect with their own feelings, and to manage their own feelings. And then you have, you know, anger issues, autism issues, all kinds of issues that result from that. So I would tell people that, yes, we need to invest in people's well-being, in their education. And of course, we need to enable that. And that this is where, for example, you know, our housing programming, our economic empowerment programming would come in.
So we can say, obviously, that yes, today there's this collaboration with BVLGARI that have been here for so long. And it's not only about the blast of Beirut. Obviously, we need to always shed light on the people that are in need in Beirut, could be Lebanese or others. Correct me if I'm mistaken. And this is always in the best of supporting the education of the children and their future, because this is basically the core of everything.
Yeah.
Is there a specific website that you would like to share with us, or any details of how they would want to support any initiatives that you might have?
So if that's okay, I can send you those links.
Of course.
You know, I can work with my colleagues here, but yes, I will send you those links.
Okay.
We did set up something for the Beirut blast specifically, okay. But as you mentioned, and as we've discussed, the Beirut blast is visible and is shocking, and rightly so. But there's a series of events that have led to the Beirut blast, and really our focus, as you said, you know, with BVLGARI in Lebanon, outside of Lebanon, and then in general, is really to reach, you know, the most in need children, the most vulnerable children, and then yes, nationality becomes irrelevant. It's really about the need, and that is the main starting point.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time today. And obviously, we'll always be in touch. Anything that you guys need, we'll be happy to support you as much as possible as well, and get the word out there for people to know more of how the things are evolving and what other needs that you might have in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you, much appreciated.